exploring the distinction between literature and philosophy. When you, Iris Murdoch, were writing both a novel and philosophical works, were you consciously aware that you were engaging in two fundamentally different styles of writing? Did you notice that your approach to each was distinctly different? Yes, very much so. These two fields, literature and philosophy, have such contrasting objectives and employ vastly different techniques. I strongly believe that it's important to keep them separate. In essence, when you're writing philosophy, it often resembles science in its form and structure more than it resembles literature. Literature, of course, operates under its own set of rules and creative methods. Its purpose can be to entertain, to mystify, or to evoke various emotional responses, whereas philosophy aims primarily to clarify ideas. Clarification is essential in philosophy. It's about unraveling complexity and making things clear. On the other hand, literature frequently involves mystification, creating illusions and layers of meaning to enrich the reader's experience. Literature often seeks to entertain, to tell a story, or to evoke imagination, while philosophy concentrates on dissecting concepts and understanding truth. Having read many of your works, both your novels and your philosophical writings, I've noticed something interesting about the way sentences are constructed in each. Your novels tend to have sentences that are somewhat opaque. They carry a heavy load of connotations, illusions, and ambiguities. The language is rich in nuance and often layered with multiple meanings. In contrast, your philosophical sentences are clearer, more translucent. They aim to communicate one precise point at a time with minimal ambiguity. I hope this observation holds true. As a writer, I certainly have a recognizable style in my novels, but I hope that my philosophical writing would be entirely different in tone and structure. I would be pleased if readers couldn't easily tell that the same person authored both. You mentioned earlier that philosophy's core aim is to clarify, while literature's aim is to mystify. I find this distinction quite compelling. It seems that a novelist or playwright's essential task is to craft illusions, creating worlds and perceptions, whereas philosophy's main goal is to dispel illusions, to pierce through them, and to free or liberate the mind from false appearances. Is this contrast a fundamental aspect of the difference between the two? Absolutely. Philosophy involves identifying a problem, holding on to it persistently, and pursuing it doggedly. A true philosophical mind is characterized by this relentless focus, the determination to grapple thoroughly with an issue. Now, considering the contrast between literature and philosophy, let's examine each separately. How would you define literature when contrasted with philosophy in this context? I don't think it's possible to offer a strict, exact definition of literature, nor is it necessary here. We know what literature is. It is a form of art that employs words. Essentially, literature is art by its very nature. One way to define it might be to contrast it with journalism or other forms of writing. For instance, great journalism can be considered part of literature. Literature itself is a broad and varied field. Borderlines are often blurry, and it encompasses many styles and purposes. One notable point is that philosophy, especially within the European tradition, is quite small in terms of scope and influence. Despite its limited size, its impact and depth are profound, but compared to the vast landscape of literature, it remains a relatively tiny field. When we look at the entire scope of philosophical inquiry, we notice something intriguing. The core questions that tempted thinkers centuries ago are still with us today. Some people see this persistence as evidence that philosophy hasn't really advanced. In fact, Alfred North Whitehead once put it provocatively by declaring, "All Western philosophy is but footnotes to Plato." What he meant was that Plato laid out the contours of the discipline so precisely and so comprehensively that later philosophers have largely been exploring the territory he first mapped. The deeper you dive into Plato's work, the more you realize he anticipated nearly every philosophical issue and treated them with remarkable sophistication. Shifting to literature, we enter a field that is both wide-ranging and endlessly varied. While fiction, novels, short stories, and poems often take center stage, we shouldn't forget that essays, memoirs, historical accounts, and personal reflections also fall under the banner of literary work. In fictional narratives, authors invent worlds and characters, following implicit rules of storytelling. They adopt masks, create dialogues, and play with readers' expectations. Poetry, too, dances along these boundaries, leaning on rhythm, metaphor, and often an unspoken agreement between writer and reader. Telling stories is so natural that we do it constantly, even when recounting our own day. If you share what happened at work or describe a funny moment with friends, you're structuring events into a narrative, complete with a beginning, middle, and end. Notice the joke you slip in at the punchline. That's pure storytelling magic. Interestingly, philosophy rarely indulges in outright jokes. You may encounter clever witticisms or playful turns of phrase, but a full-blown joke is uncommon. In truth, we inhabit a literary atmosphere, whether we realize it or not. When we write a letter, chat online, or craft a novel, we take formless experiences, raw feelings, chaotic events, random observations, and transform them into ordered, coherent expressions. This impulse to impose structure is at the heart of every art form. We gather the rubble of life and build something that resonates, educates, and endures. Among literature's many goals, entertainment stands out as essential. We read stories to be amused, to escape, or to share a laugh. Philosophy, by contrast, aims to bring clarity and order to vast, abstract questions, yet it can also uplift us by showing how a well-constructed idea makes sense of confusion. Still, philosophers often approach comfort with caution, wary of imposing a too neat solution on complex, unruly realities. Both literature and philosophy, then, serve to cheer us, enlighten us, and, for better or worse, shape the formless into form. One particular temptation that philosophers, by the very nature of their pursuit, must consciously steer clear of is the urge to seek comfort, or easy reassurance. A truly dedicated philosopher, in my view, remains steadfastly focused on their ongoing work, demonstrating a persistent and unwavering commitment to grappling with the core problems at hand. This kind of dogged determination is an essential part of the philosophical process. It means holding on to difficult questions and refusing to let go until they are thoroughly examined. This relentless approach, interestingly, often runs counter to certain common literary techniques or devices. Why? Because it frequently necessitates a degree of repetition. Philosophy, unlike many forms of writing, is inherently iterative. It involves circling back to the same fundamental concepts and arguments, revisiting familiar territory, and sometimes even dismantling or reshaping the intellectual structures or forms that one has previously built. You've made several insightful points, particularly in your description of literature, which implicitly highlights its differences from philosophy. I'd like to take a moment now to explicitly spell out some of these contrasts. For instance, you mentioned just now, and I think it's a really striking observation about storytelling, that it feels natural to us, that it's something we all engage in, and that it's woven into the fabric of everyday life. We certainly seem to universally enjoy being told stories. Philosophy, by contrast, feels almost counternatural, or perhaps more accurately, unnatural. What I mean by that is, philosophy fundamentally involves the critical examination and analysis of our own beliefs, and perhaps even more challenging, the underlying assumptions or presuppositions upon which those beliefs rest. And it's quite remarkable, isn't it, how much people generally dislike having this done to them. None of us are particularly fond of being subjected to such deep analysis, especially when it involves questioning the very foundations of what we hold to be true. This process can make us feel quite vulnerable, insecure, and frankly, uncomfortable. As a result, there's a strong, innate resistance within us to engaging in this kind of activity ourselves. Yes, I absolutely agree. It is a profoundly unnatural undertaking. When someone first begins to study philosophy, and I've certainly observed this firsthand, while teaching the subject, people often seem very hesitant to participate in this game. Or they simply can't grasp how to even begin. This is because it demands adopting a rather peculiar and unfamiliar perspective. It's famously difficult, of course, to provide a concise definition of philosophy, especially for someone who is completely new to the activity. Trying to articulate precisely what it is can be quite challenging. At its heart, philosophy is concerned with conceptual frameworks, with the very deep-seated structures of our beliefs and knowledge, and with the nature of meaning and significance. It is partly, of course, connected to language, in the sense that it explores how our words relate to the world around us and similar fundamental connections. Crucially, philosophy is neither science nor art. And I believe it's incredibly important to emphasize that distinction from science, don't you? It seems to me that the moment you fully immerse yourself in scientific methodology and inquiry, you are, in a sense, stepping outside the realm of philosophy. While the *style* of philosophical reasoning might sometimes appear systematic, or even scientific in its rigor, the actual activity itself is distinctly not science. It's more akin to a deep, reflective contemplation on fundamental concepts. As Bertrand Russell famously put it, philosophy deals with those questions for which we currently lack definitive answers. I believe prominent contemporary philosophers like Isaiah Berlin and others share this perspective. This means philosophy involves taking a close look at things we typically take completely for granted, the everyday assumptions that guide our lives, and suddenly realizing just how strange or complex they are upon closer inspection. Yes, indeed. However, one significant aspect that philosophy does share with science, I think, is that both disciplines are fundamentally driven by an attempt to understand the world, to comprehend our environment, and to grasp our situation within it. But here's the key difference. This attempt to understand in philosophy is not merely about expressing personal feelings, attitudes, or subjective views. There is a genuine effort, and this was implied in something you mentioned earlier, I believe, to subject oneself, one's ideas, and one's arguments, to criteria that exist independently of one's personal perspective. In essence, the goal is to articulate something that is impersonally true, something that holds validity regardless of who is stating it, or their personal biases. Absolutely, and as you mentioned earlier when discussing your own writing process, you pointed out something quite interesting. You noted that your novels have a very recognizable literary voice, a unique personality that comes through in your fiction. In contrast, you said you wouldn't mind if your philosophical writing was considered to have no personal style at all. This observation really highlights a key difference between creative writing and philosophical writing. For a novelist or any imaginative writer, having a distinct literary personality is almost essential. Readers are drawn to works that reflect a unique voice or perspective. If a creative writer lacks this individuality, their work often fails to capture our interest. On the other hand, philosophy operates differently. With philosophical texts, the personal style of the author is much less important. For example, you could study all of Kant's philosophical works in great detail, and still have little sense of what Kant was like as a person. This is quite different from literature, where the author's personality often shines through. Of course, literature itself is diverse. Some writers have a very distinctive style, while others are more neutral. But in general, creative writing is closely tied to self-expression. The desire to express oneself is a fundamental motivation for many artists and writers. Without it, the drive to create art might be missing altogether. Philosophy, by contrast, is not about self-expression. It is fundamentally about constructing arguments, and examining whether those arguments are valid, or whether their conclusions are true. I've noticed that when I talk to friends who are intelligent and well-educated, but not familiar with philosophy, they often assume that philosophy is just another branch of literature. They think philosophers are expressing their personal worldviews, much like poets or novelists do. It can be challenging to explain why this isn't the case, especially in a brief conversation. One reason is that philosophical problems have their own histories. Each philosopher enters the ongoing conversation at a particular moment in that history, and if they make a contribution, it's similar to how a scientist adds to the body of scientific knowledge at a specific point in time. If there's no new contribution to be made, then there simply isn't one. In this sense, philosophy is deeply connected to its own history, perhaps even more so than art is connected to the history of art. Furthermore, writing novels or poetry involves much more of the writer's and the reader's personality than philosophy does. Engaging with literature is often an emotional experience, both for the creator and the audience. Philosophy, on the other hand, is a much more narrowly intellectual pursuit. In fact, I would go so far as to say that for a work to be considered literature, it must evoke some emotional response. Philosophers, like scientists, actually strive to keep emotional influence out of their work. Literature, in a way, is a disciplined craft designed to elicit certain emotions, which is part of what makes it enjoyable and impactful, sometimes for better, sometimes for worse.